In this Elden Ring Nightreign video, we're going to be talking about some of the pushback that Elden Ring Nightreign is getting from the Elden Ring community and across the gaming community as a whole. Some people were a little disappointed to find out what this game actually is, it being more of a roguelike than like an open world RPG. But I think there's some other reasons why people are maybe a little bit more negative on this title than previous FromSoftware titles. So let's get into what those are and where those perceptions are coming from. So I think the first point here is that FromSoftware has kind of painted themselves into a corner because of the high quality games that they have produced over the years for over a decade now. And obviously the most notable one is Elden Ring, being kind of like the pinnacle of all of their game development experiments, having released in 2022. But everyone kind of expects better and better from them every single time they make a game, which is frankly pretty unrealistic to sustain across multiple decades without ever having like a step out of line or a step in the wrong direction. If you look at Dark Souls 2, which is still an absolutely fantastic game, a lot of people thought that was kind of a backward step from Dark Souls 1. So it's not like they've never done this before, but they tend to catch a little more flack for it than the average developer. And I think part of this as well is that even though Nightreign looks fantastic, and I really can't wait to check it out during the network test in February, I think I'd be lying if you looked at the game at first glance and thought this is going to be better than Elden Ring as a whole. There's just much less of a game in Nightreign at first glance. Of course, it's still early, but the lack of character creation, having fixed heroes, potentially less lore and world building, or potentially a smaller game map to play in. These are all things that are kind of a step down from Elden Ring, and that's fine. We also know that the game is going to be $40, so you can expect a $40 quality game or amount of content compared to the full price of a normal game release. But when you look at these things, it's not hard to see or guesstimate that Nightreign is probably not going to be as good as Elden Ring. And another aspect of this is the reused assets in the trailer. You see a lot of things that you've seen in previous FromSoftware games. This is something FromSoftware has always done. They've reused assets a lot, whether it's with weapons, boss design, story concepts. But historically, they've been given a free pass for this since the experience that they generate as a whole is always so good, and a lot of their reused things are often presented in a new way. But when you look at Nightreign at first glance, it doesn't look very new. There are obviously some clearly new features in terms of movement speed and some very unique abilities. But when you look at it, it doesn't look like its own brand new game, and some people have stated that it looks more like an Elden Ring mod rather than its own game because of those reused assets. And secondly, Shadow of the Erdtree, while fantastic, seemed a bit incomplete. The first half of the expansion was 10 of 10, no question about that, but I felt like the second half was kind of rushed, maybe empty a bit. There were certain areas of the game where you could explore and you just found nothing. And I think it can be inferred that perhaps some of the reason for that was Nightreign's development, and even if it's untrue and a different team was working on it, it can sort of create this perception that can make people a bit jaded about it, particularly because the release of Nightreign, which is going to be sometime in 2025, isn't going to be that long after the release of Shadow of the Erdtree. So them being that close together might make people speculate that maybe they just finished up Shadow of the Erdtree so they could finish production on Nightreign. And another point about this that I want to mention is that interviews are suggesting that the size of Nightreign is about the size of Limgrave, but that was also said about Shadow of the Erdtree when it launched. And we all know that Shadow of the Erdtree was much, much larger than Limgrave. So we'll have to wait and see how large Nightreign actually is. And I think it's likely it's going to be larger than we think. Another point that has some negativity surrounding it is that Miyazaki himself is not directing the game. In fact, Junya Ishizaki is. He has worked previously for FromSoftware on projects including Dark Souls 1, Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, and Elden Ring. So we should still be in good hands here. But Miyazaki himself has had little involvement past the initial concept design of Nightreign. And as we all know, Miyazaki is the creative genius that's driven FromSoftware forward, and him not being involved makes the fan base instantly worry. And I think some people can draw parallels to Dark Souls 2, which he was not involved much on that project. And again, as I mentioned before, people kind of saw Dark Souls 2 as a step backward from what FromSoftware is typically capable of. So when you draw that parallel, you instantly have a little bit of cause for concern, or you can see how players might have this. And another contentious point for this game that's a bit strange in my opinion is that you cannot play 2-player. You're only able to play the game solo or with 3 players total. This is a very strange design decision that I think is kind of frankly outdated by modern gaming standards. There are games in days gone by that have done things like this, where they forced players to either play with a certain amount of players or with 1 player. But it is kind of a weird gaming development concept that, if you can play 3 players, why can't you play 2? It's probably for balancing reasons. I'm sure they have their reasons for it. But when you look at it, it's kind of hard to explain to players and justify the logic when you can absolutely play 3 players. And then my last point is kind of a symptom of the industry at large, and there's kind of a few things to this point. But the first thing is that Nightreign has been stated not to be a live service game, and that's great. It's not going to have microtransactions or battle pass or anything like that. But you can't help but look at it and think that it has the potential to add heroes or bosses sold as a DLC or an expansion or something like that. And even though that's different, I think a lot of players these days can confuse these points and think that it's going to have, microtransactions or a battle pass. There's just been a constant barrage of games that have microtransactions and battle passes that don't need them, that have inserted them in order to just create additional revenue, that I think it has players fearful, particularly from, large AAA studios. So I think that's where some of the confusion and fear comes from. And again, another symptom of the industry at large is that there's been this trend, particularly with AAA game studios, where they see one game that's like a breakout title or maybe a couple of games, and then they try and mimic that game in their game in order to drive the sales numbers that those games do. The biggest comparison for me almost immediately is when you look at Dragon Age: The Veilguard, where it looks like it was tried to be designed in a way that was similar to God of War. They saw the success of God of War. They tried to mimic that to some degree in their game in order to reach a wider audience and to sell more copies. And one aspect of this is the loot system that you seemingly see in every modern game these days, where they have a rarity system that's color-coded. Dragon Age had this. There's so many different games nowadays that have this, where it's like green for uncommon, blue for rare, purple for epic, and yellow for legendary, whatever. That concept has been so overused in gaming, it makes you kind of cringe inside whenever you see that. And Nightreign is going to have a loot system with a color-coded rarity. So that is a little bit disturbing when you hear that. And there are other trends out there that you can see in this game. For instance, hero-based games are being pushed pretty hard. I think a lot of people are trying to get out of character creation and they want to make specific characters. You're seeing these in more and more games. And roguelike and roguelite games are also extremely popular, and you're seeing games add elements of these types of games into them to try and make people like them a bit more. You see this with Remnant 2, for example. They've added like roguelike modes to their game. You're seeing this with Mortal Shell did the same thing. That was another Souls-like that added like a roguelike element post-launch, and I know there are more games that have also done this. So when you add all these things together, it can be perceived that FromSoftware is sort of chasing the modern trends of gaming in this title. And I think this is what makes people so fearful about Nightreign, even if they think themselves that Nightreign will be a good game. Because I'm not worried about Nightreign itself. I think Nightreign is going to be a fantastic roguelike game. I think it's going to be absolutely excellent. But I think what this game has done is it's made people question the overall direction of FromSoftware and what their vision is for their future games. Because we've all seen great studios, particularly huge AAA studios, rise and fall over the last decade because they changed the core direction or the key elements of their games. And people really, really don't want this to happen to FromSoftware, myself included. And unfortunately, while there were several early interviews of the game that gave a lot of details about how Nightreign is going to play, and thankfully they did because it was a bit confusing when you first saw the trailer, unfortunately, in those interviews, we don't really see the trademark genius of FromSoftware and what's really going to make Nightreign interesting and stand out from the rest of the games in the genre. Like, we don't see exactly what that is in that. We see the base mechanics and some of the things like that. But what are the things that are really going to make this game stand out? Not a lot of that was covered in the interviews, and I think we're probably going to have to wait for the network test to get our hands on the game ourselves before we really understand where that is, because I'm sure it's in this game. Just remember, though, that all we have right now is one trailer for this game. That's it. That's all we have. We have one trailer and some interviews. And I remember when Elden Ring was first showcased and interviews came out for that, many people were just calling it Big Dark Souls. And we know as of now that Elden Ring ended up being far more than Big Dark Souls. So that should give you a little bit of comfort when you think about this game if you're worried at all. Personally, I'm really looking forward to Elden Ring Nightreign. I love roguelike games. I love Elden Ring. The mashup seems fantastic to me. FromSoftware does not make bad games. Even the games that you could consider like not up to their standards like Dark Souls 2 are still phenomenal games in their own right. So I have no worries about this at all. And for those out there that are worried about the general direction of the studio and what this means for FromSoftware, whether they're going more mainstream or not, I would say that you're probably jumping the gun here. Let's give FromSoftware the benefit of the doubt. Just because other studios have made mistakes along the way, there are plenty of examples of studios that have not. Look at Larian with Baldur's Gate 3. They just keep putting out banger after banger. And they were even considering making a spin-off of Divinity Original Sin called Divinity Fallen Heroes. If you remember that game, I don't know if that's ever going to see the light of day, but it was also a spin-off of that game, and that looked really good. So it is possible for developers to do things outside of their comfort zone or out of their expectations and still make good titles. And I think it would have been really easy for FromSoftware to just keep making Dark Souls games. You know, they could have just done Dark Souls 4 and then Dark Souls 5 and then Dark Souls 6, and they probably would have just made bank on those games. And I really love that they have not done that they went and made Bloodborne and reinvented the Souls formula, and that they made Sekiro and it had its own mechanics. It was familiar but different. And then, of course, Elden Ring and its majesty were absolutely fantastic. FromSoftware could have easily just taken the route of let's just keep cranking those games out and we'll just keep making money, but they don't do that. And that's what I really like about FromSoftware. They take chances on new games, they learn from them, and then they incorporate what they learn from them into new games. I want to hear from you guys on this. Did you guys know some of this information? Are you a bit skeptical about the game? Are you not worried about anything of these at all? We have our wiki put together, and we're starting to add data from all the interviews and stuff like that. And obviously during the network test, we'll be continuing to add stuff. And I think I'm probably going to put out some more Elden Ring builds. It's kind of inspired me. I was not expecting that announcement yesterday. But I want to hear from you guys. What do you make of all this? Let me know in the comments below.